Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Panmure House, Adam Smith's last and remaining home here in Edinburgh. My name is Adam Dixon. I'm the Adam Smith Chair in Sustainable Capitalism here at Panmure House, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and to be your host for this hour. Now, I hope on this beautiful Edinburgh evening, when you have hundreds of different events you can go see, maybe you just stuck around after seeing an amazing play earlier, that you're here perhaps because you love Smith, your friends brought you along, or maybe you just don't know who Adam Smith is and you thought this is an opportunity to learn a bit more about Adam Smith and this amazing house that we have here in the center of Edinburgh. So Panmure House was first built in 1691, excuse me. It was the town seat of the Earl of Panmure, hence its name. Smith lived here between 1778 and 1790. And while here, in this very room, or at least the one upstairs, we believe, he completed the final editions of his two great master works, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, or at least I hope you are. After this evening you will be. But the one that most people know is The Wealth of Nations, and you will have seen downstairs a copy of the first edition of the Wealth of Nations. But during this 12 years that Smith lived here, the house was a hub of intellectual enlightenment and discussion about all of the big issues of today. In the 21st century, Edinburgh Business School and Heriot-Watt University have returned it to that purpose, and hence the lecture series that we're running during the Fringe. This house was rescued in 2008 from dereliction, and the university spent £5.6 million renovating it to its 18th century standard that we enjoy today. I should remind you that Panmure House is not a museum, nor is it a shrine to Adam Smith. Rather, we see Panmure House and the legacy of Adam Smith and the legacy of the Scottish Enlightenment as an invitation. It's an invitation for us to forge new thinking and innovative ideas on the pressing issues of today. And the lecture this evening, though it will be about Smith and the theory of moral sentiments, our speaker will bring it to 21st century concerns. Indeed, the kind of questions that Smith and his contemporaries were asking and reflecting on are in many ways no different than the kinds of questions that drive many contemporary debates, from the origins of morality to what makes a good political economy. What makes countries wealthy, prosperous, and just? How can we address poverty as an issue of material well-being, but also an issue of happiness and aesthetic enrichment? As such, Panmure House programs are designed to engage us with the big issues that we face today and to promote a nuanced, respectful debate at a time when it is much needed. Tonight, we are here as a Fringe venue, which I think is very exciting. Of all the places you can be in Edinburgh on this beautiful evening, you've chosen to be here in Adam Smith's home. And hopefully we can transport you back to the 18th century when he lived here, but also bring you back to the 21st where we are today. It is my pleasure to welcome our speaker for this evening, Dr. Roos Slegers, who comes to us as a professor from Tilburg University in the Netherlands. Most of Dr. Slegers' scholarship sits at the intersection of philosophy, literature, and economics. An interdisciplinarian, much like Smith was during his day, and like many of his contemporaries who are well-read and not focused on specific disciplines per se. She is particularly interested, Dr. Slegers, in 18th century authors, obviously Adam Smith, but also Mary Wollstonecraft, and the relationship between their work and conduct, literature, the novel, and the rise of the middle class. Dr. Slegers spends considerable time thinking about neoliberalism, free markets, bureaucracy, and organizations. Dr. Slegers received her PhD in philosophy from Fordham University in New York, an MA in literary theory from Leuven University in Belgium, and an MBA from Babson College in Massachusetts. Please welcome Dr. Roos Slegers.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Professor Dickson. Thank you very much to the people from Panmure House having me, and particularly Blair Barrows, who's just been an amazing host. And thank you very much for coming. It's super exciting to be part of the Fringe and to get to talk to you about Adam Smith. Now, like Adam mentioned, I will be talking primarily about the theory of moral sentiments. And one of the things I love most about Smith is his really subtle and rich moral psychology, and especially the things he has to say about vanity, which in the end, according to Smith, springs from our very deep and universally shared desire to be loved. I will argue that to read Smith today really can help us understand what's often referred to as the narcissism epidemic, right? People sort of derogatorily talk about Gen Z as, being too much into themselves and pictures of themselves, etc. I think if we read Smith today, and this is not just about Gen Z, it's about all of us, right? Like, Smith tells us something about vanity that can, I think, add a lot of nuance to this debate. But we'll see if you are willing to follow along with me. So like I said, most of the quotes today, in fact, all of the quotes today from Smith are coming from his theory of moral sentiments. And in order to get to vanity, I first want to talk a little bit about Smith's notion of sympathy and what he calls, in one of his many beautiful musical metaphors, the harmony of sentiments. With an understanding of sympathy and vanity, we'll then tackle some issues in social media and what is often referred to as celebrity culture. And I very much invite you to share your associations, examples, thoughts, obviously, in the Q&A after. I hope to, spark some thoughts there. But starting first with vanity, with sympathy. A tightrope dancer. Even if you've never seen somebody walk a tightrope, you've probably seen somebody stand somewhere up high, and you've had that sort of cringing sensation, or perhaps a tingling in your fingertips where you can't help, it's involuntary, it's a reflex where you feel for them. According to Smith, the sentiment of sympathy is a really broad spectrum that includes many things that perhaps today we wouldn't categorize as sympathy. It is, you might remember the Oscars a couple years ago when Will Smith, another Smith, went up and slapped Chris Rock. That was unexpected, and many of us flinched. Not just because of the surprise, but to see somebody struck, you have that physical reaction. And biologists today will talk about mirror neurons, right? There's a lot of science today actually backing up these observations that the theory of moral sentiments is full of, and that for Smith, all are part of this this deeply human feature that he calls sympathy, where the fellow feeling, as he puts it, with these physical sensations, but, for example, even with fictional characters. I hope you've read Pride and Prejudice here in the superior BBC rendition, better than any other movie based on the book. There's Mr. Darcy, right? And when he says, "In vain I have struggled, it will not do, my feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you." We feel with Elizabeth Bennet, who is thus addressed. We can feel sympathy with fictional characters even. And Smith was very widely read. He talks about sitting in the audience, watching a play, and being so engaged in the play where we are fully aware that these people are not real, and yet we may cry at what befalls them. So the capacity for sympathy is really, in most of us, very developed. Queen Elizabeth died. Yes, this is no news to you, but I've used this example for students before to talk about this notion of sympathy, and this went slightly awry. I'll tell you in a second in what way. When I watched the televised funeral, I was very much moved, but I also realized that one of the reasons I was moved was because I'd seen The Crown, right? And so I thought I knew Queen Elizabeth in a way that, of course, I don't. And I project all sorts of stuff onto Harry and William, and I was telling my students, well, and then you see this and you feel moved. And one of my students, who's from India, raised her hand and said, "I don't feel any sympathy at all." Good riddance, I say. now, she was the only non-white student in this class, right? So to me, that was a learning moment where, yes, our sympathy is universally shared, but what we sympathize with, who we sympathize with, of course, can differ from person to person because of very understandable reasons. And we'll get to that sort of gap in sympathy later on. Smith doesn't talk much about animals, but I needed to put in some cats. You know, like adorable animals, right? Our sympathy extends not just to our own species. And again, even though Smith doesn't talk about this, or at least not to my knowledge, our capacity for sympathy, it ranges from, you know, from the fictional to real life events to other species, and really is probably the best thing about human beings. What here in Smith's own words, you know, throwing in a few choice quotes here and there, he writes about this fellow feeling, right? Whatever may be the cause of this sympathy, or however it may be excited, whatever brings it about, nothing pleases us more than to observe in other men a fellow feeling with all the emotions of our own breast, nor are we ever so much shocked as by the appearance of the contrary. So we want to be sympathized with. To receive sympathy is really the best thing there is in human relationships. And when people don't sympathize with us, this is shocking to us, incredibly painful. It makes us very lonely, sad, perhaps even angry. It's from the Dead Poets Society. The reason I'm using this slide is Smith has this wonderful, the theory of moral sentiments is full of these little bits where he says, explaining this capacity for sympathy, that even if there's a passage in, say, a novel or a poem that we've read so many times that it's kind of lost its power over us, reading it to somebody we care about, again engages us and reawakens that passion that we felt when we first read it, say. This also, I don't know if you've had this experience on, say, a first date, where you talk about a particular song that you love and the person you're talking to hates it. That's it, right? Deal breaker, it's over. This desire for us, we'll see in a moment, this harmony of sentiments, right? To share in sympathy, to receive it, and to have that bond with others is incredibly important to us. A stock image for hospital visit. Smith talks about the pain we feel when we actually are in a situation where we want to sympathize, but we just don't feel it. Sometimes there are these situations where, say, a friend is in the hospital and we go visit them because we know this is what you do. We're friends, you go visit them in the hospital, but you're there and you can't help but think that you'd much rather be at the Fringe Festival or, right, do anything else but sit there. And you're sitting there and you're going through the motions and you're saying the sympathetic things, but you're not feeling it. And Smith, again, subtle moral psychologist that he is, points to the pain that we feel when at our own failure to sympathize. And I just think that's such a subtle insight and such an important one, again, where he recognizes like how important it is for us not only to receive sympathy, but to be able to give it to other people as well. It's very much a two-way street. So in Smith's words, again, sympathy enlivens joy, right? Something good happens to you. You want to share this with especially the people you love, and them sympathizing with your joy, assuming there's no envy in the way, right? It increases your joy. And of course, when you're sad, other people sharing in your grief will alleviate it, right? Make it a little easier to bear. Here I Googled stock image for bored friend, and I just thought this one captured it wonderfully, right? So again, right, in Smith's own word, what I was just pointing to, like, it's so disagreeable to us when we feel like we cannot muster the sympathy that we know the situation calls for, but it's simply not there, right? So something really odd happens here, says Smith, because, I mean, utilitarians, right, they will tell us, we do anything to avoid pain. But Smith actually said, well, in this case, we would rather have this fellow feeling, feel pain with them, because that would make us feel that we're there with our friend, than to avoid this pain. This is actually a pain that we're sad when it's absent, right, in particular, at particular occasions. Right. So what we strive for then is a harmony of sentiments, right? And like I said before, Smith is full of musical metaphors. He says, we will adjust our pitch like in a, if you're talking to strangers and something sad comes up that has happened to you, you might talk about it, but you talk about it in a different way than you would talk about it to a close friend, right? We are constantly trying to quite literally harmonize, right, adjust our pitch in order to create this sympathetic bond, to maintain it, or right, this give and receive. There's David Brent from The Office, who I think is just a perfect example of another tidbit in Smith that I think captures this notion of sympathy so perfectly. You have perhaps been in a situation where I am now, where you're standing in front of a group and you thought, I'm going to put in this little joke and it's going to kill. And then nothing, right? Crickets. That is a terrible, terrible, terrible feeling. I've been seeing some stand-up comedians here as part of the Fringe, and you feel their pain when the joke doesn't land. And this doesn't have to be for a large audience. It can be any sort of situation where you thought you were being witty and nothing, right? And Smith talks about this to illustrate how important this harmony is, and that when it's absent, it's crushing, right? It makes us feel very lonely, perhaps even ashamed, embarrassed. And well, I think David Brent, right? He might be a little less sensitive to it, but it's a great, he's a great example. So the language Smith uses here, right, to describe this desire for sympathy and how we go about it, is he says we want to enter into the situation of this other person. We want to go along with them. We want to bring their situation home to ourselves. And when we can't do this, like I said before, this gets in the way of a friendship. This can actually hurt us when we cannot achieve this harmony. It's one of you've perhaps, if you've, depending on how familiar you are with Smith, you know the bumper sticker phrases of the invisible hand and the butcher and the baker. And my favorite one is to be loved and lovely, which Smith thinks is our deepest desire. And what he means by this is not only do we want to receive love, to be loved, but we want to be worthy of that love. We want to be lovely. We want to not just be praised, we want to be praiseworthy. To feel that the love that we are receiving actually pertains to who we are, rather than to perhaps some misguided notion that people have about who we are. And one of the, I think, deeply tragic tendencies that Smith points to, and that he writes about so beautifully in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, is that even though this is our deepest desire, we get into our own way in this really sad sense that we build up all these appearances, right? Accumulate all these things that we know will attract admiration from people around us, but those things can become a barrier to them actually knowing us for who we are. Now, I told you we're going to talk about social media, and we'll get there, but perhaps you're already starting to see where this is going, right? I mean, just sort of point ahead, I think Smith, more than any other author in the time from that time, shows us that all the appearances we're so obsessed with, right, and are encouraged to be obsessed with, especially in a commercial context, those appearances sort of build up a wall between us and the people that we want to love us, right? But that can't really get through that wall because we've erected it in order to get their approval. But we'll get more specific about that later. First, we need to talk about vanity. So what is vanity for Smith? Smith really sees vanity as a corruption of this desire for sympathy. We want to be loved and lovely. Now, one way to get there would be to develop our virtues, right, and become wise. But this takes a lot of time and also has the real drawback that only a few people will really know about your virtues, because virtues and wisdom, these are things that are known only to our intimate friends, right? This small circle of people who really know us for who we are. It can feel, particularly in certain contexts, much more appealing to, rather than just have a few people that really know and appreciate us, to have lots of people see us and admire us for perhaps not so virtuous and wise things, but it doesn't matter because it feels like, well, more is better, more love is better, but there will always be this nagging voice, Smith says, right, for the vain person, and he says most of us are vain, this nagging voice that sort of tells us, yeah, you're receiving all this love, or what looks like love, but are you actually worth it, right? Does this love pertain to you or to, right, this image you created of yourself? Today we might say this image you've created online, right? A much happier and possibly much more beautiful version of yourself that lives out there, and perhaps the distance between that character and yourself is ever increasing, creating more and more room for that voice to really start to bother us. That said, right, vanity is a vice, but it's more of a folly, Smith says. It's a vice of a very interesting sort because it's a vice that can actually serve as a stepping stone to virtue. Without vanity, there probably wouldn't be progress of any kind. It is vanity, not too much of it, and in the right combination, right, compensated for with some other virtues, that makes us stand up in front of a group, right? That makes us perform. Without vanity, no Fringe festival. You'll also notice, right, that's where the investors come in, right? Vanity drives industry, according to Smith, because, you know, think about it. Like, if we only would spend money on the necessities, on like food and shelter and the sort of the bare necessities, like the economy would come to a screeching halt, right? Like much of what we purchase, goods and services, are because we want to be seen in a particular way. We want to dress in a particular way. We want to travel. We strive to have particular jobs that come with status, and that status often derives from the amount of money you make with that job. So vanity drives industry and also drives invention, right? Innovation, artistic creation. So some vanity, Smith points out, is actually a really good thing. The problem is we often go over the top. And Smith mentions Julius Caesar here being murdered as an example. You know, without vanity, Caesar wouldn't have crossed the Rubicon, wouldn't have conquered Rome, wouldn't have gained all the admiration, respect, love, right, that he received at one point. But then he claimed he was a descendant of a goddess. People thought things were getting out of control, and he was murdered. So vanity, right, has this really dark side too. And in the theory of moral sentiments, Smith tries to figure out, okay, so where's this tipping point? How can we actually direct vanity in the proper way so that it leads to innovation and good stuff, right, rather than, well, assassination in this case, right, or people just doing anything to be seen and to admired, neglecting, you know, this other path of virtue and wisdom altogether. You might have seen images like this. We're going from Caesar to a reporter of The Guardian who took 3 pictures of herself. The first two to the left that's an old model iPhone, that's a newer iPhone, and that's a one with that's a Snapchat filter, right? So this is the same person who obviously looks different depending on the mode she used to photograph herself, to take a selfie. Now it turns out that even between different model iPhones, the iPhone will actually decide what will make you look a little bit better than you actually do, right? So apparently, you know, this is the better version. It slightly alters your image, even when you just take a selfie. You remember when we all needed to move online during the pandemic. Perhaps some of you used Teams, right? The Microsoft video conferencing tool. I found out that only because this was in the news, that for the first year we were all using Teams, if you went into settings, your appearance was actually touched up automatically. You had no say in the matter. They actually touched it up like 20%, just sort of assuming that, well, all of us at least need that. Right, but which also meant that, you know, you might have looked at the screen and thought, oh, you know, like this is actually not so bad. Then you look in the mirror, different story. It had sort of smoothed out some wrinkles and touched up skin tone and whatever was necessary, but again, built into this software. Then, of course, when you purposely use a Snapchat filter, it's a different issue altogether. And you've no doubt, well, maybe not no doubt, but you might have heard of Snapchat dysmorphia. Something especially young women are prone to. And a Snapchat filter, like you can see here, will often sort of enlarge your eyes and change the proportions of your face slightly it still looks like you, but it's clearly not you. And there's this fairly disturbing new trend where especially young women, not exclusively young women, but especially young women will try to get cosmetic surgery so that they may look more like the rendition, right, Snapchat gives them of their appearance. Because the idea is, well, that's who I should be. That's the more lovable, right, the more admirable image. That's the image of myself I want to go out into the world. Also, that's the image you post of yourself. Now imagine if you have to spend most of your time at home because there's a pandemic or for whatever other reason. This is how people know you. And then you show up and you don't look like that. Depending on your sensitivities and other proclivities, this can become a real problem. Now, and just to make sure that we all know we're not just talking about young women here, there was also during the pandemic a Twitter handle called Bookcase Credibility. And it was a person who had picked up on the tendency of professors who had to teach on Zoom or on Teams to sit in front of books in order to sort of give off an air of authority, and that professors possibly being less vain about their appearance, though. Don't get me started, right? Where the vanity comes out and like, oh, look at the big books I have sitting behind me, right? So just to point out that the vanity can, of course, we can be vain about our appearance, and it always is in some way about appearance, but how this manifests can, of course, differ greatly from person to person. Now, no talk on Adam Smith is complete without a reference to Taylor Swift. She's on tour, as you no doubt know. And a few weeks ago, she swallowed a bug. And this made it into the news. Well, I don't know, Dutch national news in any case. She swallowed a bug and everyone was paying attention to it. And this is sort of like what I mentioned earlier about celebrity culture, and I'll take us back to Smith for comparison in a moment. The smallest thing that celebrities do or that happens to them is news and is interesting, right? Now, whether the Dutch National Public News Organization should have gone along with that, I'll leave for you to decide. But she swallowed a bug. I swallow several bugs every day. I'm on my bike a lot, and nobody ever reports on it, right? Just to sort of, make the point, which is a fairly obvious one, that, the smallest thing that happens to celebrities is news. Okay, so with these issues in mind, right, the Snapchat dysmorphia, the sort of vanity, and how our online environments really encourage us to be vain. It's almost impossible not to be vain because you have to constantly moderate and cultivate your image in one way or another, right? Curate it is often the verb that is used. And this issue about celebrity culture, I want to briefly discuss two characters from the theory of moral sentiments. And the first is the Sun King, right? Louis XIV, Louis XIV. And Smith has a wonderful few pages like describing Louis and his step and deportment, which he says, were super fancy, but could suit only him and his rank, and it would have been ridiculous in any other person. Any other person who would have walked, and Smith talks about how Louis XIV held his arms in a particular way and tilted his head in a very peculiar way, but only he could get away. It was extremely elegant and everybody admires it, but had anyone else walked in that way, they would have been laughed at. So this person has a very particular status that is so elevated that basically everything he does is fascinating and also appropriate somehow and admirable. Smith says about this disposition to admire and almost worship the rich and the powerful, and to despise, or at least to neglect, persons of poor and mean condition, is the great and most universal cause of the corruption of our moral sentiments. So just sort of unpacking that, Smith says there's another figure who I'm not quoting here, but is a very interesting anecdote in the theory of moral sentiments, the poor man's son. And he talks about the poor man's son as somebody who sees the carriages of the rich come by and literally looks up at them. And there's this very interesting mirroring situation which then takes place where the poor man's son thinks, wow, I notice myself admiring this person, and I imagine what it would be like if I were sitting in the carriage receiving this sympathy I am feeling for this person. And so I would love to be them, because I would know that other people, right, quite literally below me, would look up to me and give me that admiration and respect. And what is the tragic life story of the poor man's son is that he strives his entire life to better his condition, to make it into the carriage, right, buy his own carriage and ride around, and then on his deathbed realizes that all of this was to achieve something that, now that I have it, appears entirely worthless. Right? That doesn't end well for the poor man's son. Right? But it's this, where does it come from? Again, the desire to be loved and to be lovely. And if we see these models around us, right? And again, this modeling function is very peculiar and works only because we feel ourselves admiring them and then picture ourselves in their situation and hence aspire to become them. It corrupts our moral sentiments. Why? Well, because so often will we be inclined to give up on virtue, wisdom, right? Perhaps even receiving true love, whatever that might be exactly from somebody, but sympathy in that sense where you know the other person for who they are, in order to sort of have more of it, right? Have these more ostentatious signs of wealth, of status, etc. Perhaps, this expresses itself in, just working nonstop. It doesn't have to be money. It often is, though, right? But perhaps it's the status of a particular job. And again, we can be vain about anything, right? You can be vain about the charity work you're doing. And perhaps one of the things we can discuss later is like, well, what does proper vanity look like, right? Before it sort of tips over in something else, as Smith discusses it. But what he points to here is that there's this real problem where we just have this tendency to worship, and it also means that the rich can get away with anything. And that what in them is seen as like, oh, just peccadillo, right? It's just something funny they do. Like if somebody poor, right, or below that person in the hierarchy would do the same thing, they're probably thrown in jail, right, or worse. Terrible things happen to them. We forgive the rich. And again, why is that? And here is Smith, the subtle moral psychologist again. It is because we sympathize with them, right? We put ourselves in their position, and we, in a way, we're almost already there by projecting ourselves onto them, and then we forgive ourselves as them, right, for these things they're doing. It's a very complicated, very strange dynamic that Smith points out is very dangerous because, of course, it only increases inequality, right, on top of the wealth inequality. You then also get sort of a moral inequality where they can get away with anything, whereas, people from the lower ranks cannot. I Googled hovel, Scottish hovel. This is what I got. During Fringe, I think you can still charge probably a significant amount to rent that out. But so this not the poor man, but the poor man's son, but the poor man here. And this is, I think, a really interesting passage from the Theory of Moral Sentiments. He writes about this poor man: to feel that we are taken no notice of necessarily damps the most agreeable hope and disappoints the most ardent desire of human nature. Right? Because you need to be taken notice of to be sympathized with. If nobody sees you, nobody can love you. The poor man goes out and comes in unheeded, and when in the midst of a crowd is in the same obscurity as if shut up in his own hovel. So the poor person is invisible not just when he's indoors, but wherever he goes, nobody sees him. Now, there's a whole other conversation to be had here about homelessness and the invisibility, whether it be close by or far away, of poor people, and also media attention. Again, think of Taylor Smith with her bug, who is extremely visible, and terrible things befalling poor people, and you never hear about it. But this, I think, is a really important point Smith makes here, because what makes poverty so terrible? Well, of course, if you can't even provide for the necessities for your family, that is a hardship. But to not be seen, to be unnoticed, that is just devastating. Because again, to receive sympathy, a minimum requirement is that you are seen, right? You are in some way acknowledged. There's no sympathy for the invisible. Okay, so For Smith, this idea of feeling seen, also in that 21st interpretation of like, okay, I feel seen, which people often say, okay, you're not just visible, right, as opposed to invisible, but you're seen for who you are, right? You feel recognized, you feel appreciated for the very particular individual that you are. And of course, this dynamic that I've already mentioned several times, like on social media, we get into this very strange situation where we try so hard to be seen, but in trying so hard, what people actually see might not be us at all, but again, the much happier, sort of idealized, touched up version, right? If the software doesn't do it for you, right, people will often, not post unfiltered pictures of themselves, be very selective in what they show, only say incredibly witty things, right, on Twitter, X. Feeling seen, and the way that is, this desire is, you could say, exploited by particular companies really preying on this inclination toward vanity. Reading Smith today really gives us, I think, a very allows us to, be quite nuanced about the sort of moral psychology underlying that. Of course, and you've heard about this research and about the whistleblower sort of showing that the self-esteem, particularly of certain groups of people, is very much pegged to their success online. There's another angle here that I'm not going to explore, but just mention, where we now have a way to sort of quantify the sympathy we're receiving, right? Am I loved and lovely? Well, just see if you get any retweets, re-X's. What do we call it now? I don't know. Right, like if I mentioned earlier the joke that doesn't land, but posting something that you thought, now I'm going to be seen, and nobody responds, or there's 2 likes and that's it. It's very hard not to peg your self-esteem to that, because now you actually have like data, right? How many followers do you have? Like, how many people have actually seen you in that super oversimplified metric where it's basically thumbs up or, well, no thumbs, right? It's 1 or 0. I realized, this of course is all rather bleak. There is hope. What then is? There's hope in education, because this, and again, this is one of my favorite lines in Smith. He says, the great secret of education is to direct vanity to proper objects. Smith says, look, there are vices that need to be stamped out. Vanity is not one of them. Vanity, again, it can turn really dark, like it did, for example, in, like, say, Caesar or some autocrats you might think of. But it often is a folly that we can sort of laugh at. And more importantly, it's something that in especially young people, you don't want to completely discourage. You want to guide it towards the proper objects. Now, of course, the question is, what are those proper objects, right? Well, they'll have to do something to do with this virtue and wisdom that came about earlier, right? Like, vanity means that you have a desire to strive. And like I said earlier, right, it drives industry. It also makes us put on amazing performances at Fringe, right? Scientific discoveries, you name it. A lot of that is spurred on by vanity. This is why education is so amazingly important, according to Smith, because this is the time when people are young to direct that vanity, right, in the proper channels, right, towards the right objects, so that we might actually innovate, make the world better our own condition and that of other people, but we need guidance there. In closing, I want to sort of point you to an example and just see what you think about it. I think here the response is not determined by what generation you are, but there is sort of a rough correlation. You've heard of Mr. Beast? Yes, some of you, yeah. So Mr. Beast is a YouTuber who, I think the biggest YouTuber in terms of followers right now, who gained, well, so he's a YouTube celebrity, but also became just a celebrity, I think recently, when one of his projects went more than viral and actually also made it onto the regular news. And that was that he he paid for cataract operations for people so that they might see it again. So, and he cured, right? He paid for 1,000 eye operations. So 1,000 people who could not afford this surgery could now suddenly see. So it says simple surgery. And, there was one camp who said, well, look, okay, he's drawing attention to this appalling problem that this is a fairly cheap operation, which nevertheless many people cannot afford. So, systemic injustice, etc. There's a more cynical take where people said, okay, look at the history of Mr. Beast, this YouTuber who now has the money to be able to do this sort of thing. Look at his history. It turns out he didn't start with charity. He started by, I think one of his first videos was just that he counted to 1 million, filmed himself. And, he sort of skirted the edges of some more right-wing content also. And at a certain point just sort of landed on charity as like, hey, people feel really good about themselves watching this, and by clicking on the video, you're automatically donating 2 cents to a good cause, and that makes people feel good about it. So this is just a win-win, right? Like these people would not have been able to see if it weren't for Mr. Beast, who has all this money because he has all these followers. At the same time, right, his desire for all these followers and to be seen there's vanity involved. My suspicion is this is not the kind of thing that Smith had in mind, right? Because it's a more sort of consequentialist view. But anyway, I just wanted to sort of offer it as like, okay, there's clearly a lot of these sort of vanity projects going on that you could objectively, if there's such a thing, right, say do good in the world. At the same time, they are also promoting a machinery or that perhaps isn't completely conducive to virtue. So really curious about your question. Thank you so much for your attention, and looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Well, that was fantastic. If you thought that Smith was just about free markets, I'm sure that was the assumption of some of you, and we won't hold it against you for thinking that, because that's often the image that is portrayed, that Smith is this uber-libertarian free marketer that just is all about self-interest and selfishness. But actually his work is so much more, and that reading is actually incorrect about him. And Dr. Slegers' excellent lecture put Smith into that light, right? That we can learn so much for him. So to kick off the Q&A, I'll ask a question about social media. So we see that social media use among young people is endemic, and we see that it has had serious consequences to mental and emotional well-being. Anybody that's worked in universities over the last 15 years or 20 years can track the decline of student well-being along the trajectory of when did Facebook come out, when did Twitter come out, YouTube, Shorts. I have young children and I stress about their screen time, and we're very strict parents about what they can do. And education is one. Education from parents, education in schools. But the question then is, how do we regulate that? Do we regulate it from the state, right? So there's so much debate around free speech and censorship. And one reason why Elon Musk bought Twitter, now X, was he had issues with the censorship. And now some say he's censoring, and now there's calls to, governments should get in. I'm curious how, I won't ask you the question, how would Adam Smith think about the question of regulation? But thinking about the theory of moral sentiments, how do we as a society, if education is one of those tools for addressing this, how then do we as a society, let's say, regulate social media in a way that we can take advantage of the positives, right? Where we're out there, we're communicating, but we minimize the damages, whether it's the bigger social ones, but also the damages to the individual people that I think are harmed by some of the vanity and that we see from it.
Yeah, that's a really difficult question. I've primarily focused on the way Smith can help us sort of diagnose the issue in what I think is a more nuanced way than we often get in sort of mainstream media. Perhaps one way into answering, or partially answering this question, is that I paid attention, obviously, primarily to the negatives, right? Like you mentioned, the whether it's actual like full-fledged mental health issues or just the misery that goes with the doom scrolling we might all be involved in at times. There is a group of people who in most research actually comes out very differently, and that's like queer kids, right? So queer kids in, say, Kansas or whatever, right? It doesn't have to be in the US, but right now that's an obvious country to look at, who actually find community that otherwise they would never find, and actually do feel seen finally, right? Even if from their family or their direct surroundings, they're not getting any of that, right? The sort of healthy visibility and feeling like, okay, now I can receive sympathy because I can actually be who I am. And I'm thinking also of virtual spaces where people appear, as hot dogs or manga figures or whatever, and have these like amazingly, or to me, amazingly profound conversations. So I do think it's important to look there as well, because there might be some insights to be gained as to how we can, try to turn it around, or sort of encourage a literacy in social media that would be more geared towards health rather than all the harm that is caused right now. Now, what that would look like, I find that incredibly difficult. Also because I noticed that in talking to my students, there is a generation gap there already, where they're despairing at particular things or being outraged at particular things. There's a real sensitivity that comes also with that age bracket. So I don't have I'd be waffling mostly, right? Like I think a lot of the answers need to come from the people most involved, your kids perhaps, right? Involved in it, but also the people who are experiencing the benefits, because I do think those are significant as well.
Right, so we don't want to overregulate.
Never overregulate.
Never overregulate.
Yeah, but obviously some regulation, but it's so complicated.
But Smith
right?
would always be skeptical of a big hammer regulation, right?
Right, but also wouldn't be fully anti-regulation either, right? So yeah.
Okay, so we're going to open up the floor to question. We have a microphone because we are recording and want to get your voice. So the gentleman in the back, please.
Well, Adam Smith wrote, thank you very much for fascinating presentation. The Theory of Moral Sentiments was written much earlier than The Wealth of Nations, and if I understand it correctly, he still worked later on a kind of new edition. So as an expert in this field, would you say, did he change his views over, can we follow, let's say, any change in his views? Would you say that his views were formed very early and then just expressed across his lifetime?
Yes. So there are people who could talk much more intelligently about this than I can. I've mostly studied sort of the final version, also to because you're right. He revised it many times. Adam actually just told me that a third of the book was written right in this very house. Like all these additions later on.
Likely in this room.
In this room.
Or upstairs, possibly.
Okay, good vibes, right? So from what I know, these were all sort of expansions and enrichments of the original theory. I don't see any big departures from what he set out to do, but rather sort of adding layers. And one of the things that I think is particularly fascinating, because he's revised it so many times, and yet he left in a lot of these sort of quaint anecdotes, and also these things where he seems to struggle with, for example, this tension of like, okay, right, a growing economy is good, but if it is at the expense of individual moral character, that is really problematic. And he didn't try to smooth that over, even though we know he had so many opportunities to do that if he wanted some sort of grand, perfect system. And he wanted to do justice to the phenomena as they presented themselves. And that's what I particularly like, that in those later editions, he left what he left in rather than what he took out.
Can I just have a very quick follow-up question? How much was it a kind of debate against Mandeville and Hutchinson? Was it,
Oh, yeah. Well, that is a can of worms that perhaps I'm going to leave closed for now, though I'd be happy to talk to you after, like his relationship to Mandeville. It's fascinating, but that is a lot to go into here.
No, I don't want to go into that, but I think there's one perception that some have about Adam Smith where they treat the theory of moral sentiments as this, this very different work from the Wealth of Nations, because the Wealth of Nations is presented as the case for capitalism, as if you like, or the case for free markets, and that the theory of moral sentiments comes along, and that's why there was this Das Adam Smith problem that came around, and which tried to put, some German scholars proposed this. But actually, if you read Theory of Moral Sentiments and Wealth of Nations as one book, there's lots of continuities between his thought, and in many ways Adam Smith was a realist, and he was just trying to look at the trade-offs of the society that he lived in, and how did we get here, both as a society economically and politically, but how do we get there as humans? What's our interrelationships, right? I mean, that's where the Theory of Moral Sentiments, the subtitle is, your neighbors, right? It's about how do we get along with our neighbors. And the Wealth of Nations is bigger, macroscopic, but the two works are very well integrated, I would say. So there's not kind of this Smith that all of a sudden had this epiphany that I need to be more moral when it comes to economy.
Right. Yeah.
So we have in the front. Just wait. Just one second for the. Wait. Yeah. So wait. That's okay.
Oh, you have a question as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll go to the front and then sorry.
Hello. Right. I was reading a text about this sort of thing recently, which started off by raising the word sympathy, and saying, or as we say in English nowadays, empathy. Now, is this an important distinction? Smith never saw any need to invent. I don't think the word empathy exists in either of his books, or I think in any other author of the 18th century that I've been able to read. Empathy is really an invention of the last 20 years. I don't think I heard it before then, but now I hear it all the time. I would say almost that empathy has become a more common expression than sympathy, because empathy can be used not just in technical philosophical discussion, but about life in general. This singer's songs arouse a great deal of empathy in me. So what? I think this is an important distinction which we ought to try to define. So what is missing in the word, or the range of meaning of sympathy, which is present in empathy? And what does empathy bring to our discourse that sympathy fails to touch?
Right.
And if we can define these things, should we then return to Adam Smith and try to see how he fits into this pattern, whether there were things about empathy or even about sympathy that Adam Smith missed, and whether he would have been better for looking at something like the 21st century definition of those terms.
Yeah, thank you. Perhaps we can take your question clearly is related to this.
But
Maybe we can take them together?
Those together, but then we also need to get this gentleman in the gentleman in the back who I had the microphone taken from.
This was
sorry.
Yeah.
The empathy thing was pointed out to me by a very distinguished psychobiologist who happens to live in Scotland, and it's actually from the Greek, and it means understanding how other people are feeling, but not necessarily sympathizing with it. So a hunter has to be able to empathize with his prey in order to chase it. And I imagine that the owner of Twitter can empathize, but I don't think he probably can sympathize. And I suspect, because psychopaths empathize really well. So it's weird that empathy has taken over as the word that we're using, and it's always so nice to read Smith and see him using sympathy, but it's not the same thing at all. And I wish I could listen to more of this, because I've got to.
Oh, okay. So I'll be quick in my because I know we're short on time. So the thing I was going to mention too is that one of the things I really like about Smith is that he writes at a time where this interdisciplinary approach is de rigueur, right? Like right now, this separating out of biology, psychology, moral theory, empathy will be used in very different ways by a psychologist and then by a biologist and by a philosopher, so that it almost depends on what discipline you're picking, what definition you're going to use. So one way I would actually suggest sort of sidestepping the issue altogether is, and the reason I started with that tightrope walker, is that for Smith clearly gives this whole range of examples, which includes what we would now call empathy, right? And things that where we would probably reserve the term sympathy. But it is really important to understand that for Smith, it is not this. One of the reasons I think people shy away from using sympathy is because it tends to imply pity and also suffering primarily, right? Pathos, right? The Greek derivation. For Smith, it is fellow feeling with any feeling whatsoever, right, in another person's breast. And so this can be joy too. So not only does it include, I think, what we would now call empathy, it also widens it where it's not geared primarily at suffering, but also very importantly at being able to feel with, right? Sim being the Greek with the passion of other, even if they're very positive passions. Much more to say about this, right? But that would be the short answer for now.
Let's take the gentleman in the back. We might have time for one more question. So if you, so just very quickly.
Great presentation. I learned a lot. So one of the things you said was when people have a high status, high moneyed, we often make excuses for them. And that seems certainly anecdotally true. I don't know the exact literature on that. I imagine you do. But for me, anecdotally, also the converse is somewhat true in the sense that they're not short of people who are wanting to knock them off their high horse, so to speak. I mean, an example might be someone like Donald Trump or the British royal family, or even someone like Taylor Swift, for example. They're not short of their critics as well as their complimenters, so to speak. Do you have comments on this?
Yeah. So is your point that they're also more vulnerable actually because they're
perhaps
so visible?
But would you agree? Do you have comments on that?
So I have many thoughts on that, but I'll be very brief in summarizing them. I think this whole phenomenon around cancel culture, right? I think Smith has a lot of insights that apply there too, where, actually being very visible also make you can fall much further, right? If you're on a high pedestal. However, the people you mention, right, like think, for example, of Trump or Elon Musk for that reason, right, but Trump has been indicted how many times now? It actually is garnering him tons of support and, well, we might say sympathy, right? Like the MAGA folks are rallying around him because he is a victim now. So I think in many of these situations where people say, oh, this person is being canceled, almost in all those cases, they're still making tons of money, right? Oftentimes their fan base has increased, even though it has shifted, right, of people who sort of like come up around them. So again, there's exceptions to this, but the people who are effectively shamed into invisibility, they tend to be people who said the wrong thing and were sort of nobodies already, then went viral because they said the wrong thing and now are never able to get a job again, right? So I would say that overall fame definitely protects you even, right, from being canceled, which in the end just gets you more attention for many of these folks, right?
We have time for just one quick question.
Thanks. I very much liked your message at the end of hope and how the education could be a way of using Vanity to be directed towards proper objects. So just in the spirit of this sort of debating chamber, as it were, the children of Edinburgh in their last year of primary school, for 1 week, they're sent away to camp to the Highlands or to the west of the Argyllshire, and they have to leave their phones at home, which kills them. But then they have a glorious week in the countryside and are directed towards proper objects, which is fantastic. But then when they come back, they just go back on there's no transfer, you see, so they go back onto the phones. So what I would like to discover would be, if you have any ideas, other weeks or other versions of camp or other things that you could do to extend the time that they don't go on their phones at all. It's not even reduced screen time, it's like whole week off of phones, and none of them die. They all survive.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
exactly.
I'm not expecting you to have an answer.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
was just like,
No, I think we're conveniently out of time, but this is quite wonderful, though, right? I mean, I propose as a sequel an Adam Smith camp where we all go off into the highlands, right? I don't know about the funds of Panmure House, but no, but this is a wonderful example. But also, you know, like you say, you probably see the tremendous benefit from this sort of digital detox. But then how, you know, I imagine though it's sort of a reference point, right? Where even though they go back to their phones, they have had this experience where actually. Right, like there is something very special to be gained by stepping away.
We're going to do one more question. This gentleman there, yes, please, and then we'll finish on that.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed the presentation. I'm minded to think of one of the more malevolent uses of sympathy and manipulations of it. So if one of the primary drivers for chatbots and influencing elections is outrage, in fact, this is the most significant, how do we educate and inform society to guard against negative actors manipulating our sympathy and driving vanity for dire consequences?
Right. Oh yeah. No. That so. As you just mentioned, right, in The Wealth of Nations, right, like again, too often these books are read separately. You really need them together because Smith talks there about the dangers of, say, the division of labor, how when we become like too, you know, narrowly focused on one thing and don't expand our minds, read widely, talk to different people, we become susceptible to demagogues, right, and to sort of what we now might call sort of outrage culture, right, where we all just sort of pile on, and online this is even easier. So one of the reasons Smith says education is so important is to cultivate your mind, right, expand it so that you will not be easily swayed by some sort of autocrat. Now, we don't need autocrats for that, right? All it takes is influencers or what have you, and you say there's bots who can do this work. So that to feed that kind of outrage, like for me, it's helpful to return to what for Smith is the core, right? Our desire to be loved and lovely. And I think we all have a reservoir of bitterness, well, maybe I'm projecting onto you here, right? But slights, ways in which we haven't been seen or regarded, and that people can sort of tap into by saying the right thing and get us riled up, even if it's not directly related to that pain we might be carrying around. Like Smith, I think, allows us in this very disarming way to see that that pain is there, right, because we didn't get that love, which we so desperately need, right? And this is not to cheapen it in any way. I think this is actually a very profound insight for Smith to see that, well, cultivating this sympathy, right, whether we want to include empathy, like that's at the heart of all this, and sort of the outrage and the way that might spread, right? That is the thing he kind of foresees in a way. It's what we get when we are too narrowly focused and don't, open up and sort of recognize that many of us, most of what we do, including, or actually especially the very strange things, are to get attention because we want to be seen, right? Because it's the only way in which anybody's going to ever love you. Maybe that's a good point to end. Yeah.
That was a fantastic lecture. I just want to thank you all for coming to Panmure House. If this is your first time, I hope you enjoyed and felt a bit of Adam Smith presence here. If you're interested in Panmure House, please do go to our website, panmurehouse.org, and sign up to our newsletter to follow other activities. Even if you don't live in Edinburgh, our intent is to go global. But we have different events throughout the year. The Fringe is one of the most important in terms of opening to the public. But we do have open days throughout the year. So on that note, I'd like to thank our speaker, Dr. Roos Slegers, for an excellent and wonderful conversation.